Okay, hey everybody. I wanted to go over a little bit more about how to use these nonlinear deformers to sort of set up a basic rig for our character or for our ship, and to sort of do a little simple animation with it. So we're going to go ahead and work on that. And so I wanted to sort of describe the scene first. I have this layer where our environment is, and it's frozen, so that's why you can't select the moon or the stars, and those are just objects that are in the scene. This of course is our light, and so and it's set to render with mental ray, so if you don't have the mental ray plugin turned on, you probably want to do that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to we can move this object around, right? We can, if we needed to do that, or even if we needed to do some squash and stretch, we could sort of play around with, with doing that. But that's really the extent of deformation we can get on it. So if we wanted something more complex, like we wanted it to bulge in a sort of feel like it has a belly right in the middle, or if we wanted it to bend, there's a level of deformation we need to add to that. And you'll notice that I keep bouncing back and forth between cameras. I wanted to sort of quickly show you, we can set up any layout that we want. And what I usually have is this two-panel layout where I have, this is my camera that I'm going to eventually render from, right? And you'll notice that if I select that camera, all the channels on that are locked. That means I can't accidentally move it, right? But then this camera over here is my perspective, and I can tumble around. And if I wanted to change this to my top camera or something, I can go to panels, orthographic, and set that to my top so I can see it from that angle, right? I'm going to go ahead and leave it in my perspective, and I can just bounce back and forth between those with tapping the space bar. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply a deformer to this. Now Maya has all sorts of different deformers. They're found under the animation menu set here, so we go to animation, and they're hidden under animation deformers, and so, or anim deform. And so if we click on that, you'll see like it looks like we have two, but there's actually a whole list of them that are hidden for some reason in Maya 2016. If you're using a different version, it may or may not be hidden, but we're just going to open that full deform menu list. So the ones we're going to look at today are these nonlinear deformers. And so if we go to nonlinear and I click on this little double line here, it'll break that tab off, and we can just have those to try out and play with. So I'm just going to show you how a few of them work. If I select the ship, let's try bend. And I click bend, it's going to apply that deformer to it. And if I go in here and hit 4, you will see that there's a little line right in the center of that. That line is the bend deformer itself, right? And that's something I can move around if I want to, but I'm just going to leave it in the center of it because where it's placed is actually pretty important. So I can go to the bend input over here, and this is in our channel box. I can move it around, like I said, we're getting our translate and rotate channels, but our bend input is where we're actually going to make it deform. And so if we go to inputs and then bend 1, then we can change stuff like the curvature or the lower high bound. So watch what happens when I change the curvature. I'm going to click on the word curvature. Out here in my viewport, I'm going to middle click and drag from side to side. And you'll see what happens is it sort of gets a curve in it, right? And that deforms the object, right? Now the placement of this, though, is very important. Like the placement of this, we can see it in here, but the placement of the curve itself is very important. And so if I moved it up, it's going to do something weird to it, right? And it's going to change. So like where this curve is and how it's oriented is really going to change how this object bends and deforms. Right, we can get some really weird deformations, and this can also break really easily because of that. So what you want to do is you want to get it positioned where you want it first. So let's say right now it's bending forward and back, but I really wanted it to bend from side to side. So I'm just going to rotate that deformer 90 degrees. And that way, when I play with this curvature factor, it's going to wiggle it from side to side. Now the other thing you'll notice is that it's affecting the entire thing, and it's bending it from the center, right? So if I really wanted to play around with this, I can affect the low bound of this. I can tell it, no, don't affect the bottom, right? Or affect the top more, right? And by doing that, I can actually sort of change the area that's being affected. So I could actually bend this down all the way down, or pull this down all the way to the bottom now. And I just moved the bend controller, so I did. Now the curve does something slightly different, right? And so, or the curvature bend. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this because the bend is not necessarily what we're wanting it to do right now. What I want it to do, or let me show you a couple more really quickly. We have like the sine deformer, which if we change the wavelength on it, or I'm sorry, it's the amplitude we have to change, isn't it? Amplitude and then wavelength, offset. Then we get sort of this ripple through it, right? So these are different ways we can deform this object. There's also a twist. I have to have the object selected. Twist, and I can play around with this low bound, high bound. I'm sorry, not low bound. Start angle and end angle, right? And so I can bend the bottom of it, or I can bend the top of it, make it sort of look like it's looking around, right? And I can also combine these if I wanted to apply a bend to that as well. Bend. Keep in mind these inputs are on the model itself as well. So if I grab the model itself, now you see I have the bend and the twist inputs in there. So I can, bend it, and I can twist it, right? And so this isn't the only way that we deform objects in Maya, but these are some pretty easy ways to get some simple deformations, okay? And that's all we're really needing for this, because we have to realize that, we don't need everything in the world to happen on this. We really just need it to squash down, because what I want my animation to be is the character or the ship to sort of squash down toward the ground, sort of pop up in the air. I want it to hover here for a second and then squash back this way in anticipation and shoot off the screen. Okay, that's the animation I'm going to do with this ship. And so I'm going to rig it up to allow that to happen. And that's really what we're doing right here is basic rigging. Right? So I'm going to add a squash deformer to it. Now, the squash deformer, if we watch it, all of the controls are under this factor. And so if I factor that up and down, we're going to get this. Now, we want to keep expand to 1, because if I turn that off, it's really just going to scale it up and down. That's not really what we want. We want it to bulge a little bit. But, for some people that maybe is too much bulge, and so we would pull back on it a little bit, and so we get a little bit more like this type of squash and stretch. So it's kind of whatever you want. I'm all about exaggeration, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it. And so the things we need to look at here is that this object is squashing and stretching from the center, right? And so I don't really want that. I want it to squash and stretch from the ground. Now the reason, if we take our factor by into 0 and look at this, that's not what I wanted to do. Leave that on 1. I want to go to wireframe here. I did the wrong thing. 0. I'm going to go to wireframe here by hitting 4, and I'll select my squash and stretch. And so you'll see that if I adjust the low bound of this, it's going to pull it upward to the center point of the object. So if I select that, it pulled it up to the center, or the pivot point of this object, right? But now if I did the squash and stretch on it, it's really just going to squash and stretch from there. Okay, and now I want it to squash and stretch from the bottom of the object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this down until it is pretty much flush with the bottom of the object. And now if I squash and stretch it, it's just going to do the bottom of it. And that's because we need to extend the high bound. The high bound right now is set at 1. I'll extend it to about 2. Maybe even go a little higher than that. I think 2 is looking good. And so now if I adjust this factor, make it a little bit more like that, and I like that. That feels pretty neat, right? So we can make it look like it anticipates down and then shoots off, right? And so this is what we have here. Now the interesting thing about this, though, is if I adjusted this factor and scaled it down, then I was like, okay, now I'm going to animate the ship flying off. It does that as it leaves that area of what is being affected by it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little bit of change to the hierarchy. Okay, so let's talk about what that means. If I go to Window and click Outliner, open it on the other screen, but we get this outliner tab, and this is sort of explaining like sort of a file menu or a file system of what is going on inside of our scene, right? So this is very similar to what we would see in like Windows Explorer when you're like browsing through your MP3s or whatever, right? This works the same way. We need to be able to put things sort of inside of other things, parent them underneath it, right? And so what we really want is we want this squash and stretch handle to go with us everywhere we move the ship. Right? So what I could do is I click on this squash and stretch handle, or squash one handle, and I middle click it with my mouse. So I click the little mouse wheel and I drag that onto ship. And so now wherever I move ship, that handle is going to go with us. Okay? It's like just like you're moving your MP3s from one hard drive to another. If you grab the folder that all the MP3s are in and move it, it will move the MP3s as well. So we get this system here, and so now I can animate this around and turn it, and this squash will still stay with it, right? Here's the thing though, like it becomes a little inconvenient to animate this around and be like, oh wait, I need to stretch it out, so I have to go in here and dig around and be like, is it under squash? Oh yeah, it's factor. I'll adjust that and then set a keyframe on that as well. And that's just sort of a clunky way of working. It's not very efficient. And so, as it's not that animators are whiny babies, but they have to, like, as an animator, you want something that's easy to work with because animation is hard. Like, there's a lot of, in this case, it's one thing we're animating with some squash and stretch, but if we wanted to make it feel, or if we had something that was more complicated, like a character or whatever, then there could be hundreds of controls, and so what we're going to do is we're going to make this just a little bit easier on the animator, which is also us, so that's cool. And we're going to do that by pretty much just adding an extra channel in our channel box here. So we have all of these channels here for our translates and rotates and scales and visibility. We're just going to add an extra one for the squash and stretch, and what it's going to do is it's going to control this factor here. Okay, so let's show you how to do this. First we have to have the ship itself selected, and we go to modify, add attribute. Okay, now what this is going to do is it's going to add an attribute in here as an extra channel, right? And so we can change what that channel looks like. It could be a Boolean, which is picking between let's see, what is it? Picks between on and off. Or we could have this enum, which means we give the thing a label, right? Or we could have integer, which is a whole number, right? But I'm going to leave it at float, and that means it can be negative or positive, and it doesn't have to be a whole number. It can have a decimal in it. And so I'm just going to give it a name, and I'm going to call it, you can call it squash and stretch, or you can call it SS. Let's call it squash and stretch. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And when I do that, you'll see that now I get this new attribute over here in my channel box. So even though I have that attribute, that doesn't mean it does anything. Like, I can adjust that value all day long. It's just an empty value in there, right? We have to connect it to something before it works, before it does anything. And what we want to connect it to is this factor, right? We want whatever value is in there to be the same value that's in there. And so when I change this value, it will change that value. And so the way we do that is we go to Windows General Editor, and we're going to choose this Connection Editor. Okay, and so it gets a little confused about what exactly we want it to do. So I'm just going to reload these things. So basically, whatever is on our left, we can choose one of those attributes and then choose something on our right, and whatever's on our left will control what's on our right. You'll see here this from to. And so what I want to have on my left is my ship, right, because that's what has this squash and stretch attribute on it. So I'm going to reload left, and so now we get the ship over here, and if I scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that there's the squash and stretch. Now, what I want to have on my right is my squash one handle, but if I reload that, you'll see that it really is just giving me like all the translates and rotates. It's not giving me what's under this input. So what I have to do is I have to select this input under here, squash 1, right? Which is a slightly different thing than the squash handle, right? And so now if I hit reload right, you'll see that it pops up, and now we have this factor. And so that's what we were changing here. And so what I need is for my squash in stretch control or attribute to drive my factor attribute. So if I click that, you'll see now the squash and stretch was on 0 and it changed factor to 0. So I can close this and I can now change squash and stretch, and it's going to change how my character is deformed, right? Now the interesting thing is now I don't even need to see this anymore. I can actually hide that if I wanted to. So I can go back to my Windows outliner and I can grab this squash 1 handle, and if I hit Control H, it will hide it. Right? So now I don't even have to see that, but I can still get the effect of it. Right? And so this is a pretty nice little thing that we can just start animating. Right? So before I start animating, I'm going to go look at my camera, because this is the camera I want to animate from. Right? This is what I want. This is what I'm showing my audience. And so, like we talked about with the 12 principles, this is staging. This is how. This is my canvas. So I'm thinking of composition. I'm thinking of arcs and angles and how to lead the eye around the scene. And so I'm going to go ahead and just start setting some keyframes. So I hit a keyframe there. That's just to kind of hold it in place, right? And I'm going to go out to frame, let's say 20. Hit another keyframe. So I'm just kind of holding it in place for 20 frames, not moving it. And I'm going to anticipate down, right? I want to pull it down a little bit with a squash. So I'm just going to use this, again, middle click out in my viewport, and it'll squash it down, right? And I have auto key set on. Now I'm hitting S to set a keyframe. I have auto key turned on, meaning if I make an adjustment to it, it will adjust, it will update that attribute that I change, right? But if I'm out here and I go out to 40 and I squash it down just a little bit more, you'll see that only squash and stretch changed. The rest of these do not get a keyframe on them. They are still unkeyed, right? So if I want to key everything, and I do just for good practice, I'm going to go ahead and hit S again, right? And so I just added a little bit more squash, so when it gets to 30, it still continues to squash down a little bit. And so if we watch that, it just kind of pulls down, right? Now, my playback speed is something you want to consider too. Right now, Maya's going to play this at 24 frames a second. If I right click here in my timeline, I want to make sure that I'm watching it in 24 frames a second. So if I go to playback speed, make sure it's set to real time, because if it's set to play every frame and your computer's somewhat fast, it will play it super fast. And if your computer's somewhat slow, it'll play it really slow, and you'll get the wrong indication of what this animation looks like, right? So if I hit play now, that's kind of what I wanted, right? Now, I wanted to sort of pop up in the air kind of quick, so I'm going to do that over 2 frames. I'm just going to stretch this out for 2 frames, right? And then I'm going to hit S, right? And so what we get is it stretches out and then it pops up. Now, I didn't bring it off the ground because I want it to look like it's pushing on the ground, like it's sort of jumping, right? I wanted to look like this stretch is sort of the result of that energy sort of popping up there. And so I keep it on the ground a little bit, and so you'll see it kind of pop, kind of launches up there. And then very shortly after that, I'll go ahead and pop it up into the air. So maybe frame 45, go ahead and hit S. I'm going to take that squash and stretch out of there, move it up. I'm also going to move it over, and I'm going to kind of angle it a little bit here. Right, so I want it to look like it sort of pops up in the air, just like that. So let's see what happens. Pop. Right. Maybe you want to go ahead and keep it over this way a little bit more. So, pop. Right. And then for a short amount of time here, I want it to kind of feel like it just kind of drifts over to our anticipation pose, right? And I'll have it drift over to there, sort of turn up, maybe pull up a little bit more. Let's see how that looks. And go ahead and hit S to sort of nail it down. So, pop, it kind of floats there. Yeah, that's good. And then I want it to quickly anticipate back again. Right, so maybe 71. I'm going to have it pull back to here, have it rotate down. Yes, I'll squash it. So we got now, pops up to there, anticipate back. Right, and I want it to hold that anticipation for a little while. I don't want it to just immediately dart off. So I'm going to go ahead and add another anticipation key here where I pull it back even more. Just keep pushing it. And I'm just going to go a little bit more on that, right? Because it's anticipating back a lot. And then over a really short amount of time, I want to do the same thing I did earlier. I'm going to stretch it out. Make sure it's pointing where I wanted it to point. That. Right. Maybe stretch it just a touch more. Oh, wrong attribute. Yep. And then I'm just going to shoot it off the screen. So W, move it to there. Want to give us one frame where we can still see it, and then the next frame, make it completely gone, right? And so this is what our animation looks like now. So, and then anticipate off and shoot off, right? And so that's this is not a bad little start. Now there's some stuff we would probably change on it, but I want to show you one more thing in here before we move on, and that's the graph editor. So this is just your first introduction to the graph editor. A lot of people find it very troubling, but don't sweat it too much. I'm going to go ahead and click this button here just so we can bring it up. So you can also find it under Windows Animation Editor, Graph Editor. And so if we click this, you'll see that basically what we have here is a graph that sort of charts the change of each of our channels over time, right? And so this is our Translate X, and you'll remember from, just sort of looking at 3D, Translate X is sort of the forward and back, the side-to-side motion, right? Let's go to my camera so we can see it, right? And so if I adjust that Translate X, you'll see that it kind of pushes it further away or closer. Translate Z is sort of our side-to-side, right? And Translate Y is the up and down, right? So this is how I made it go up and down. And so what this does is this allows us to see how that value, how our Translate Y changes over time. And for a long time here, it doesn't change at all. It stays on the ground, right? But then suddenly it pops up off the ground there, right? And so what I want it to do is to pop a little bit more suddenly, right? Like if we look at this change from frame 42 to 43, it doesn't change very much in its Translate Y. It just comes up a little bit, right? See, but then from 43 to 44, it's a bigger movement. And that's because if we go in here and look at this curve, from 42 to 43, it kind of slopes into that, right? And so that change in value over time isn't very much. But if I go in here and select this key, and I can middle click to move the key, right? If I drag and select this tangent, so let me show you selection again. If you drag to select a key, you're going to select the key. If you try to click it, you may end up accidentally selecting the entire curve. So dragging selecting will help select the key. If you try to click select that, you may get it, but there's no guarantee. So drag select that as well. And then you can adjust that curve, right? But if I adjust it like that, then I get this dip on the other side. So what I want to do is break that tangent. So I'm going to click here. It's going to break it. It's this little button here. And I can adjust how that sort of pops up out of there, right? So if I reframe that, now we can kind of see how that works, and we can shift this around and get a different result from our animation. Now, a lot of people get frustrated with the graph editor, but this is really why it's so powerful. Is it makes this feel like it has a little bit more force now when it jumps up off the ground, right? The same with the side-to-side motion. If I wanted to make it feel like it sort of pops off the screen, stop, from here to here, then I need to change. Actually, it's from there to there. I need to change the Translate Z, right? I need to make that feel like that pops off the screen too, right? And so we get a bigger bump there. So the graph editor is frustrating to a lot of people, but it's really, really powerful in how you can sort of dynamically affect your animation. I mean, even to the point that, like, if I decided that's too much squash, right? I'm like, oh, that's too cartoony. I went too far. Well, I just go in here to my squash and stretch attribute, and you'll see that down is squashed, up is stretched. So I can just sort of scale that back a little bit and just pull those keys up and make a moderate adjustment to that squash, and now that feels better to me, right? And so now it's like, okay, squash down, pop up, and flies off the screen, right? And so that's what we're going for. So, aim for this. I want you to sort of work on your own animation and come up with some other ideas. You can also, like, halfway through this, you may be like, oh, you know what, I need a slightly other, like, it just kind of drifts in a straight line there. Maybe I wanted it to go up a little bit more and out this way a little bit more. And you can make that adjustment, pretty easily. Or maybe you wanted it to dip right here as it went off screen, right? I don't know, like that. Like it's like, I don't know, that's probably not very good, but you get the idea. Like you probably want it to dip like that first. And then maybe you would aim off screen this way, right? So it feels like it kind of, I don't know, that's those aren't great changes, but I'm just showing you that you can make those changes if you wanted to. In fact, I don't like that one either. So yeah, let's continue to work on this. There's more stuff we can add later, including, as you may have noticed, a flag hanging here, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. The last thing, I think that's the last thing I'm going to cover right now. We also went over a little bit of dynamics in class the other day, but that's not absolutely necessary, and we'll be looking at that more in class later. So let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.